time, the Talmud, they wanted you to read that because Yesh Locha Chelek B'Olam Haba, if you're really yearning for the welfare, the spiritual and moral welfare for all of humanity, then you deserve to witness that being actualized. I'm trying to create myself and sharing with you a paradigm shift from an understandable concern for self-preservation, where I open the paper and I just want to see what's going on with Israel. What are they doing to us now, right? I want to hear the Israel news. I'm concerned. They all, good guys and bad guys, we have the supporters. It's all about our self-preservation. And I want a paradigm shift. I'm struggling for it myself. Because why do I need to be preserved? Why does the Jewish people need to be preserved? It's for the purpose of humanity. It's atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, a nation of priests who are the representatives and the intermediaries insofar as we the communicators and the modelers of values. And this is what we're praying for throughout. If you look at the Kedushas Hashem, it's very interesting. It's always good to tell you what's interesting, but otherwise you might find it to be boring. I told you it's interesting. It's a mailer. Somewhere here. Only 4 pages. Okay, good. Page 4. Those of you who are really familiar with the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, did you know what's the shortest prayer in the Shemona Esrei? It's one of the shortest blessings. The blessing of what's called Kedushas Hashem, that talks about God's otherness, uniqueness. I won't do the Slavic thing. Baruch atah Hashem, Hakel HaKadosh. You are holy, your name is all holy. Holy ones are always blessing you, sanctifying you. Baruch, they say Kedusha with repetition, but basically it's 5 ideas with 15 words or whatever. Baruch atah Hashem, Hakel HaKadosh. You get through that one pretty quickly. On Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur as well, you have 6 or 7 paragraphs. Page 4. What are those paragraphs doing? There's a controversy in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri as to where Malchuyot should be said. The kingship of God, is that a function of Kedushas Hayam? This is a little bit lumpish. Bear with me. It's okay. I know most of the people here, I know how intelligent you are. But but it's a little bit yeshiva shalomtish, but it's all right. You can't hear it very well. No excuses. All right. What I'm trying to say is, focus and you'll follow me, even though it may sound a little foreign. That there's a controversy between 2 Tanaic figures, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, regarding these 10 verses called kingships, where we celebrate the fact that God is king, where should it be recited? Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri argues that it should be recited in Kedushat Hashem, in the 3rd blessing of the Amidah that talks about God's sanctity, God's essence, of being totally other and totally different. Rabbi Akiva argues, and I'm not going to give the details of his argument, that it has to be in Kedushat Hayom, the sanctity of the day. We paskin like Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, Baruch atah Hashem melech al kol haaretz, God is king, and mekadesh Yisrael v'yom hazikaron, who sanctifies Israel in the day of remembrance. So when we talk about the holiness of the day, that's when we talk about the kingship of God. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, we talk about the holiness of God. That's when we talk about the kingship of God. So phenomenologically, I'd like to suggest the controversy is God's holiness is something that's imposed upon us. It's God's essence. The sanctity of the day is something that we generate on our own, because it's we who determine the calendar, not God. It's the Israelite people, the Jewish people, determine whether the month will be 29 days or 30 days, and that affects when Yom Kippur will be. It's the Jewish people who determine whether the year will have 12 months or 13 months. And even if the calculations are mistaken, that ends up being the law, which means if there, let's say theoretically, if God forbid, no one were to observe Rosh Hashanah and acknowledge it, would metaphysically, would it be Rosh Hashanah? The answer is no. If we don't generate the sanctity, if we don't say today is Rosh Hashanah, if we don't sanctify celebrate the new moon and the new calendar, then the metaphysical essence of the day would not exist. That's not true about Shabbat. Shabbat is imposed upon us because it's not a function of human decision, it's a function of God's creation. He creates this world in 6 days, and then the seventh day, he creates Shabbat and he relates to the world. He doesn't try to change it. He sanctifies that day. The sanctity of time, there are two elements in time. There's an element that we can control, and there's an element that controls us. And that's phenomenologically correct. Ultimately, time controls us, destroys us. But from another perspective, we can redeem within that. We have a tremendous amount of freedom vis-a-vis time. So, the nature of God, the God's holiness, whatever that means, that's what's imposed upon us. We can't affect. There's an element of God that we cannot affect. That's God's kingship. We're celebrating that aspect. You can say there's two aspects of God's kingship. That's what I don't know is about, by the way. Right? There are two aspects of God's kingship. On one hand, God reigned even before anything was created. He was king. And by implication, therefore he is king over all his creation. He owns it by dint of his having created the world. He owns the world, juridically. Right? You create something, it's yours. Yet, the subject is called, at the time that everything was created, Azai Melech Shemo Nikra, that he was declared king. We have the freedom to declare God king, or be agnostic, or atheist, or just ignore it, and sort of live a life independently of Hashem. That's our freedom. There's an element of God's kingship that's dependent upon our acknowledgement of it. And there's an element of God's kingship that exists independently of our acknowledgement of it. Both you toggle, right? Analogously, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, we celebrate God's kingship as a function of his essence. It's imposed upon us. According to Rabbi Akiva, this is what we follow. We make God king. This is a human choice. And that's the element that we celebrate on Rosh Hashanah. That we are free to dethrone Hashem, and we are free to embrace God's kingship and accept it, surrender to it. And that's human freedom, and that's what we celebrate. We follow Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, we follow Rabbi Akiva, and therefore the verses are said in the fourth blessing, not in the third. However, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's introduction to Malchuyos was so beautiful, they couldn't let it go. And what you have in the Kedushas Hashem, U'v'chein tein pachtecha, according to some opinions, I accept this, is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's liturgy that introduced Malchuyos. Have you ever heard that, Rabbi? And this is really very, so what do you have here? This is the essence of Malchuyos. What are we praying for? Let's look at this very quickly, and I'll get to my next topic. If you look at the third paragraph, instill your awe upon all your works, your dread upon all you have created. Let all works revere you, all creatures, all. Second paragraph, grant honor to your people, praise to those who revere you. Right? Gladness to your land, flourishing pride to David, your servant. So that's the Jewish people. As a means for the next paragraph. So too the righteous will see and be glad, the upright will exalt, all wickedness will evaporate. Through Jerusalem.